You're watching TVO.
Greetings, prisoners of gravity. This is Commander Rick, cutting in, cutting off, and cutting loose. In his book, The Anxiety of Influence, Harold Bloom claims that all the great works of art of the past intimidate new voices from expressing themselves. You know, all the good stories have been told. I mean, in fantasy fiction, after J.R.R. Tolkien created The Lord of the Rings, everyone said, wow, a whole new area for fantasy. And then they said, what's left to write? Or in comics, Walt Kelly's funny animal strip Pogo set an amazing standard for adult comics. Or in science fiction, feminist author Ursula Le Guin has proved to be a tough act to follow. But I think truly creative people can be big fans of Tolkien, Kelly, or Le Guin without being blind followers. And as proof, I offer 3 creators: fantasy author Guy Gavriel Kay, cartoonist Jeff Smith, and SF author Elisabeth Vonarburg. We'll do the show in alphabetical order, starting with my alphabetical opening, a barrage of cartoon drawings explaining for greenhorns how I journeyed, crash-landed, and was marooned. Nancy, on please quickly, Rick says.
Rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has voted English-only sign. 40,000 tons of armed with PCBs blew up the ozone layer today.
Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
Thrown, unconscious, and virtually weightless from my excellent yellow Z-28. Guy Gavriel Kay worked as a criminal lawyer before writing fantasy fiction. His latest fantasy novel, A Song for Arbonne, shot up the Canadian bestseller list so fast I saw it go past my porthole, and Guy didn't even pose nude in it. A Song for Arbonne's spectacular rise was due to Guy's reputation, which began with the Fionnavar Tapestry, his trilogy about 5 University of Toronto students who are whisked off to a land of legend. There they learn Earth is just one small part of a great mythical tapestry created by the weaver of all legends. The 5 are then drawn into the war between the weaver and the evil unraveler. With his next novel, Tegana, Guy proved he was not a 3-shot wonder and could write other styles of fantasy. And that was significant because Guy was considered a scholar of J.R.R. Tolkien, after Guy got his start in fantasy by assisting Tolkien's son, Christopher, in editing his late father's unfinished novel, The Silmarillion. How did working on The Silmarillion affect your own writing?
Having seen the drafts and the notes, the letters, the scribbled messages to himself, the false starts, I was to a certain degree inoculated against that kind of creatively destructive awe that would have led me to say, as I think many young fantasy writers did say, I can't work in this vein. Or, what many other writers did, I'm going to work in this vein and try to do the same thing. I think that fantasy post-Tolkien has tended to be split into those writers who are doing derivative reproductions of Tolkien's work, and those much more creative writers who are saying there's a much wider range to fantasy than what Tolkien did, and I'm going to go into another part of the forest. Somehow my involvement in the Silmarillion allowed me to say, I think I can work in this part of the forest and find a space for myself, that I can mine some of the same material without fearing that I'll be lost in the large shadow that Tolkien cast. That's one thing. The second really important legacy I took away from that year was the importance of doing your homework. But I don't think anyone else will ever spend 30 or 40 years building the world in which they set their novel, which of course is what Tolkien did. But I do believe that as much time as you can spend doing your world building, your background research, more recently for me that's tended to be historical research, the more you could put into that, the more solid, the more believable, credible your imaginary construct will be, and I think the readers will pick up on that.
Now, your editor told me that you take that concept so far as to go live in the various places that you're planning to use as settings for your novels.
Well, my friends say that this is entirely a cover for the fact that what I really want to do is have Café au lait at a cafe in the south of France. Without denying that that plays a role in what I do, there's no question that I find it easier to work in detail and flavor if I'm surrounded by the details and flavorings I want to work in. There may be writers who can look out the window at the Bathurst streetcar and evoke olive groves and vineyards, and I have a great deal of respect for them. From experience, I know that I'll do it better if I'm looking out the window at olive groves and vineyards. Just the color, the sense, the smell, the whole ambience of a place comes much more readily to me as a writer if I'm surrounded by it. And I do believe that God is in the details, that the more details you can bring into the book, the more likely the reader is going to be to become consumed and caught up in the story you're writing.
Having gone to all that trouble to create a world for a novel, is it tough leaving it behind and moving on to a new setting for the next book?
I'm much more tolerant now than I used to be of what I call one of the endemic vices of the fantasy genre, which is the author going to the well one more time and one more time. I still don't like it, but I understand it a little better, because after you put so much work into the creation and the construction of a setting, a world for your novel, the process of packing all that up and sticking it in a box file somewhere, 4 box files, and starting again in the construction of an entirely new context for an entirely new book, is somewhat depressing and daunting at the beginning. I'm at that stage right now, which is why I think I'm being so passionate on this subject. I finished Song for Arbonne, and I'm about to do the world building for an entirely new novel. And when you're at that beginning stage, right in the prairie or the foothills, looking up at the mountain of work that lies in front of you, there's a very seductive temptation to find yourself saying, well, why don't I try to find one more story, one more book that I could fit into the world I've already built.
I can see that. The Fionnavar tapestry played with Arthurian legends and a lot of other mythological sources. I'm wondering, when you're creating the heroes for your stories, how much do you deviate from traditional heroic archetypes?
I've always thought that in creating a page-turner, and I see myself as a storyteller first and foremost, that a great many writers only get half the equation. And this applies strongly to fantasy literature, I think. Part of the equation in creating a good story is obviously your narrative. It's obviously going to be, are exciting things happening? Are dramatic, frightening, erotic, stimulating things taking place? But that's only half. The other half surely is, are those dramatic, exciting, erotic things happening to characters we care about? Do we have some interest in the figures moving through this story in this landscape? And as a reader, my own frustration with fantasy in the last 20 years has tended to be that a great many writers can spin a good story, but I'm deadly bored by the characters in that story. And so what I'm always striving to do is to pay as much attention to the complexity, the legitimacy of the motivations of my figures, my characters, as I am to the complexity and the drive of my plot. It really is a two-sided equation. And so when you talk about the heroes, one of the things I think I try to do is make my heroes less reflexively heroic, is that the automatic hero ultimately is fairly dull. I think that's why Superman just died. That there's a notion that the routine hero is going to be less compelling to a reader than someone who does things for a complex panoply of reasons and emotions.
Right. Now, what can you tell me about your next novel?
Not very much. Graham Greene, the British novelist, once said that he never wanted to know where his books were going because then he got bored writing them. I subscribe to that. I operate the same way. And I find that in the early stages of researching and blocking out a book, if I talk about it too much, I run the risk of crystallizing my own thinking prematurely. So about all I'll say at this point is that it looks as if I'm going to be working with Spanish history in the same way that Song for Arbonne works with French and Provençal history and Tigana worked with the Italian Renaissance. I think that Spain will be the flavor and the ambience of the new book. But beyond that, why don't we wait till next year?